Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Colin Bailey, the director of the Morgan Library and Museum. I'm very pleased to see you here on this rather uncertain evening, where it is not raining yet. And I hope you've had a chance to see the exhibitions that have opened this week. Not only Piranesi, but also Claude Gillot, Nina Cacciadorian, and George Condo. But tonight we celebrate the opening of Sublime Ideas, drawings by Giovanni Battista Piranesi, an exhibition, like all good exhibitions, that has been some years in the making. John initially proposed this project to celebrate the 300th anniversary of Piranesi's birth, which would have been in 2020. And it was one of a number of projects around both in America and Europe that were scheduled to revisit Piranesi. We could not have known that the pandemic would interrupt life in the way it did. One silver lining, if you like, of this project that then was put forward was that John had more time to think about the selection of works, the topics he wanted to approach, and above all, in a way, to have the time and the industry to write a really beautiful monograph that is that both introduces Piranesi as a draftsman, looks at very many drawings carefully, and it will serve, I think, as a standard now, as one of the standard texts on understanding Piranesi, particularly Piranesi as a draftsman. For those familiar with the Morgan's history, Piranesi is, if not quite a house artist, an artist that has been studied and worked on and added to over the decades. We hold the largest collection of works on paper by him anywhere. The significant group coming through the family of Jack Morgan, and in fact owned by Jack Morgan's wife, Jane Norton Grew, whose portrait by Sargent you see as you enter the lobby. She collected a vast number of drawings, not quite sure where and how, and her sons left them to the Morgan in the 60s. As you all probably know, John Marciari, Dr. John Marciari, is the head of our Drawings and Prints department and acts as curatorial chair at the Morgan. His expertise is primarily in Italian art from Renaissance right through to the 18th century, and his interests center on Rome. He wrote a book on 17th century Rome and is working obviously on Piranesi. It is a book in a way also on architecture in Rome. But his interests are in Rome and also in Venice, and this is why he's currently curating another exhibition for the autumn on Tiepolo's drawings at the Morgan. So Piranesi in a way is a perfect topic for him. The museum will close after the lecture, but the exhibitions are up for the next 3 months, and I hope you'll come back and see Piranesi and Gillot and Cacciadorian and Condo many times. It's a pleasure to introduce my colleague, John Marciari. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin, and thank you all for coming, as Colin said, on a rainy Friday evening. It's nice to see so many of you here, and I hope you did have a chance to see the show before I begin. At our opening last night, many people remarked how surprised they were by Piranesi's drawings. In a way, this was not a shock to me. Over the years that I've worked on this show and on Piranesi, I've often asked people, what does the word Piranesi bring to mind? What do you think of? In almost all cases, people mention the prisons, the imaginary prisons, the carceri, works that since the middle of the 20th century have really dominated all attention on the artist. Although for many, these exist almost in a bubble, completely detached from the rest of Piranesi's work. This idea was, however, even more reinforced in recent years, as during the pandemic, we all seem to have read Susanna Clarke's much celebrated novel, a work vaguely inspired by the prisons, though having nothing whatsoever to do with our artist, despite the title. Some others will also associate Piranesi with the views of Rome, prints that still define our image of the Eternal City even today, which remains so popular that bad reprints of them continue to be sold as tourist souvenirs. My point is that although most museum goers will know of Piranesi, he will be a familiar name to all, most people have a rather limited view of the artist. But Giovanni Battista Piranesi was an artist of remarkable, truly extraordinary range and variety. He was a printmaker, yes, publishing views of Rome continuously from the early 1740s until his death in 1778. But he did much else. Architectural fantasies dominated his early career, from the somewhat fanciful but ultimately conventional building exercises in his first publication, the Prima Parte di Architettura, published in 1743, to the Imaginary Prisons, published first in 1750 and then in a second edition in 1761. But from the mid-1750s, he had moved on to other kinds of work. And moreover, most of his prints that we see today originally appeared as part of books, accompanied by text. These included studies of Roman antiquities and the form of the ancient city. You see two plates from his Antiquità Romani of 1756. Polemical defenses of Roman art, architecture, and design at a time when Winckelmann and others were advocating the supremacy of the supposed simplicity of Greek architecture. Archaeological treatises, such as his study of the outflow of Lake Albano and the aqueduct system that you see here, where he sent men down into the holes in the ground to understand how the tunnels worked between the lakes and the modern city. Manuals for interior design and decoration, such as the Diverse Maniere, full of chimney pieces, vases, even wallpaper designs, and the Vasi Candelabri of 1778, published just after his death, and even oddities like a volume of etchings after drawings by Guercino, of all artists, the only such work he did, which appeared in 1764. What's more, Piranesi was not just a printmaker. He, from the start of his career, always wanted to be an architect. And he did eventually, in the mid-1760s, finally get to build one building, the truly amazing church of Sant'Andrea del Priorato, up on the Aventine Hill, the Church of the Knights of Malta, with its elaborate facade and that complex piazza he designed in front of it, which, alas, is almost all that most people get to see. It's a church almost never open to the public, but everyone who goes to the Aventine looks through the famous keyhole, which frames a view of St. Peter's Dome clear across the city. You get a sense that Piranesi had a certain wit about him for designing it this way. He was also a designer. He built chimney pieces, built and designed chimney pieces, side tables, clocks, sconces, elaborate vases, and candelabri. Some built of ancient fragments, some pretending to have been built of ancient fragments, like the famous Warwick vase you see at top, which appears in a letter written by Piranesi in the exhibition. And his work as a designer went hand in hand with his work as a dealer in antiquities, who helped organize excavations in Tivoli and elsewhere, from which he became fantastically rich, much to the jealousy of his contemporaries. His sometime colleague and sometimes rival, Thomas Jenkins, called him the Cavaliere of the Candelabri, the Knight of the Candlesticks, in a fit of, I think, professional jealousy. Piranesi was famous across Europe, and some of the most important British and French artists and architects passed through his workshop. Robert Milne, Robert and James Adam, Nicolas Lullier. It's difficult to think of another artist who had such a range of interests, output, and influence at the time. Piranesi's palace and studio became a requisite stop for grand tourists and collectors, and Piranesi himself was part of the attraction. There was something extraordinary about Piranesi, almost otherworldly. He was seen by some of his contemporaries as brilliant and others as a near-complete charlatan. Robert Adam, who spent much time with him, called him in one letter written home to Scotland the most extraordinary fellow, but a few weeks later had changed his mind and was dubbing him a mad dictator and a madman. In an age that developed the concept of the sublime to describe something that was grand and yet a bit scary, Piranesi was himself practically the epitome of the concept. The great English connoisseur Horace Walpole wrote that the artists of his day needed to follow the sublime dreams of Piranesi as a path forward to modernity. For Piranesi had an imagination, quote, as savage as Salvator Rosa, as fierce as Michelangelo, and as exuberant as Rubens. Distinguished company indeed. Channeling all this and more, my exhibition title, Sublime Ideas, even plays off Piranesi's own words, paraphrasing a letter he sent to his sister in March of 1778, a few months before he died. He wrote that he had had to live away from his native Venice for his whole career because however much Venice was filled with magnificent palaces and paintings, it was, quote, not a theater capable of giving pasture to the sublimity of my ideas. Now, through all of this, through all of his works of so many different types, prints, decorative objects, buildings, there was one constant, and that was his drawing. Everything started with drawings. And what is more, the drawings were not mere sketches to work out an idea and then be discarded. Piranesi kept almost all of his drawings. He returned to them. They served him as reference and inspiration and resource for decades after he originally made them. And indeed, although we don't think about him as a draftsman for the most part, it's significant to note that in the posthumous portrait commissioned by his family from Pietro Labruzzi, he holds not a print and a burin or etching noodle, but rather a drawing of Paestum and a port crayon, a chalk holder, a drawing tool. Now, to give a sense of how drawings remained alive and active and important in Piranesi's workshop, my book begins with this work, which also appears right at the start of the exhibition. This is an early drawing by Piranesi, one that can be securely dated to 1742 or 43 as he was planning his first publication, the Prima Parte, a group of architectural exercises or fantasies akin to those by so many 18th century architects. This study is clearly part of the process that led to the so-called vestibule of an ancient temple plate in the work. Now, although drawn in Rome, where Piranesi had lived for 3 years by this point, and meant to evoke an ancient temple, this is far from an archaeological reconstruction. Indeed, the basic architect of this space is inspired not by Roman antiquity, but rather by Palladio's Church of the Redentore in Piranesi's native Venice. It has less to do with the study of Roman architecture than with the perspective exercises of the Bibbiena and the theoretical architecture of the pensionnaires at the French Academy, which happened to be just across the street from Piranesi's home. A closer look at the sheet demonstrates, however, its complicated, layered structure. Piranesi began the study in chalk, and some of the carefully ruled chalk lines that helped him establish the perspective scheme can still be seen, especially in the upper part of the drawing. In these, we can imagine the young Piranesi as a student or an academician, and like a student, he then carefully reinforced his initial chalk underdrawing with a light brown ink line and gray wash. But for Piranesi, no drawing, no matter how carefully constructed, was a precious object. His studies were instead living works, evolving elements of the workshop. And it's typical that atop this rather carefully ruled and delineated study, he began editing his work, taking up a thick pen as well as a brush and brown ink to modify the sketch. He first added a high arched opening over the central columns, but then changed his mind and turned that into an apse instead. He shifted the positions of the central columns, added niches with figures to either side, and I think it's significant how messy, how sketchy, how rough these changes are. Suddenly, he's hit his stride, and he's drawing freely instead of measuring things with a ruler and compass. He simplified some of the urns on the side. I love how he just crossed out the top of this tomb on the left. And then he added a layer of brown wash, emphasizing the shadows throughout the drawing. Though amid all of this editing, we can still make out across the flat entablature of the original scheme his joking inscription, the Imperator, the Emperor, Giovanni Battista Piranesi, this tomb erected. The Emperor Giovanni Battista Piranesi made this tomb. There's a joke hidden underneath it all. But there's more to this story, because the appearance of this space, this design in the prima parte, does not mark the end of this drawing's life in the Piranesi studio. Almost 2 decades later, around 1760, it was mounted. He mounted it, laid it down on a second piece of paper, surrounded it with a double set of brown lines, and added his signature at lower right. Mounts of this type are found on about 50 of the 650 or so surviving drawings by Piranesi. They are remarkably consistent, all on the same paper and in the same ink, and had to have been done in a single campaign. In the interest of time, I'll spare you all the arguments and just ask you to trust me when I say that these mountings all happened in 1760 or 61, when he moved from his original Roman palace to the one that he would live in the rest of his life. It moreover seems that he reinforced many of the drawings at the time that he mounted them. And this reinforcement in very dark brown ink of the sculptural group in the center of the space dates not to 1743, but to that mounting campaign around 1760. For both that dark ink and the creation, almost impossibly, of figures out of those dark blobs of ink is absolutely typical of his drawings from the 1760s, but found nowhere in the untouched sheets from 1740 or 43. But this then brings us to a third moment when we can put the drawing back in Piranesi's hands, for he keeps returning to this sheet and finding inspiration from it. A couple years later, in 1763, he's at work designing possible modifications to the Basilica of San Giovanni in Laterano. The Morgan has a number of drawings from this period showing alternate schemes, these 3 and about 4 others that are in the exhibition. Now, the most elaborate of his schemes, the one at bottom, a drawing that is in actuality about 5 feet wide, includes at center a screen of columns setting off the choir. Now, on the one hand, this does look back to the Redentore in Venice, but Piranesi hadn't been to Venice for almost 15 years at this point. On the other hand, it recalls a screen of columns as seen in this drawing, which we know he had mounted only a year or so before he began work on the Lateran. It must be the drawing, rather than some vague memory of the Redentore, that puts that scheme back in his mind. Now, in the end, Piranesi was not able to carry out his plans for the Lateran. There was a famine that winter in Rome, which put a strain on papal coffers, but probably more to the point, Vanvitelli and the other architectural establishment in Rome did everything they could to convince the Pope not to entrust that madman Piranesi, as they call him in letters, with the rebuilding of the Second Church in Rome. Never one to let a good idea go to waste, however, Piranesi then reused that same semicircular screen of columns behind the altar of the one church that he did build, Santeria del Priorato. And I wonder whether that reinforced blob of sculpture in the foreground isn't what gave him the idea for a truly extraordinary altar consisting not of the usual Roman altarpiece, but of a sculptural group rising in front of those columns. What's more, the complicated levels of steps around the Priorato altar are notable. They're not expected for a Roman church, but they do make us think of all of the steps in that drawing which are reinforced in red chalk. That's the last thing added to the drawing. The red chalk is atop all of the earlier schemes of ink. And I can't but believe that it's picking this drawing up again, reworking it a third or a fourth time as he thinks through his ideas for the church that leads to this process. Now, this is extraordinary. To be able to put a drawing literally in an artist's hands 4 times over a 23 or 24-year window is not the sort of thing that we expect to happen. It's not the sort of thing that we can document very often. And yet, this is far from the only case. It's a rather typical process. And I hope as you go through the show, you realize just how often the motifs repeat and how drawings seem to reappear in later drawings, sometimes done much later. Most of his drawings start life in connection with one particular project, but then could be reused for totally different purposes much later. I'll give you one more example. Around 1760, Piranesi made this drawing of a strange Ionic capital that used sphinxes as modifications of the volutes of the capital. It was a real capital, then in the collection of the antiquities dealer Belisario Amadei in Rome, who soon afterwards sold it to the English collector Lyde Brown, who took it home to Wimbledon, and who then sold his whole collection of antiquities to Catherine the Great. The actual column is, the capital rather, is, we think, lost in Russia somewhere. Now, this drawing leads Piranesi to include the capital as one of the many non-standard, highly decorated capitals in the 1761 Della Magnificenza, a book, one of his polemic books about the superiority of Roman art in its eclecticism and ornament. And then a few years later, when Piranesi in 1763-64 is actually building a church, he thinks, that's Sphinx capital. And he uses it completely unexpectedly as the basis for the capitals on the facade of his church, modifying it slightly to add a tower between the two sphinxes as a reference to the tower in the coat of arms of his patrons, the Rizzolnico family. That alone would be extraordinary, but remember, the capital itself is long gone, by then in Wimbledon, England, of all places. He has to go back to his drawing to do this. And then a few years further on, he designs not a real facade, but a truly elaborate fantasy to accompany another of his polemical publications, and there we find the sphinxes again. And if you have any doubt that he keeps going back to that earlier drawing, when you actually size this drawing against this one, they are the same size. It's as though he's tracing and transferring the sheet right over. Again, this is not a 20-year window. This is about a 9-year window between the first and fourth iteration. But it's typical of this practice we see again and again and again. This use, reuse, adaptation, innovation is at the very core of who Piranesi is as an artist. Not the slavish copying of ancient art, but its constant reuse and reinvention. We get the sense that for him, all art, ancient to modern, was one great living continuum. And here again, we can return to Piranesi's own words. Jumping a few years further still, in his trilingual introduction to the 1769 Diverse Maniere, he realizes how famous he is across Europe, and so publishes a book in French, a language he did speak a bit of, and English, which he seems not to have understood at all. We don't know who did the translation for him. But the introductory text appears in all 3 languages. After all, the English need chimney pieces much more than the Italians do. And a couple of pages into that text, he argues that, quote, an artist who would do himself honor and acquire a name must not content himself just with copying the ancients, but instead, studying their works, he ought to show himself of an inventive, and I'd almost said a creating genius, an inventive and creating genius. That's the source of my title tonight. Piranesi was describing himself. He didn't just take ancient or modern Rome as a model to copy something frozen, but rather used it as living inspiration for further creation. Now, all this really introduces what the exhibition is about and the subject of Piranesi's drawings, and I hope it gives you a sense of the richness that can be found in studying the drawings closely. And if you bear with me a bit longer, I'd like to hit some of the other big themes and ideas, things to look for as you come back and go through the exhibition. The first section of the show really gets to the ideas of process and education and adaptation, not merely the practical, in the practical sense of education, where Piranesi learned what, when, and from whom, but also a kind of intellectual education, how he becomes more sophisticated in his thinking and his draftsmanship very quickly. For example, there are these two drawings that are directly preparatory for another print of the Prima Parte, shown in a case just below them. And you can see how these are almost timid drawings. There's none of that spirit and fire that we have seen in the drawing that he worked and reworked, but instead just those ruled lines in chalk, the very careful inking in light brown ink, and the blue-gray wash. And a direct relationship, size to size, reversing and all, from the second drawing, the Morgan's drawing, to the print that's in the case just below it. But this process of print design is also showing just how hesitant he was, how conventional his academic education was, which is why it's all the more extraordinary how within 2 or 3 years, he's moved on to something almost completely unprecedented in the reconstruction of ancient Rome. Fantasies that go beyond anything even a Roman might have dreamed in the scale of the building and just the energy dedicated to a drawing. It'd be an amusing thing to try to count how many figures are in this sketch, which is only about a foot wide. But even for all of the labor put on this drawing, it's still a working drawing. There are pediments that sort of hang off the side of the building in ink as corrections. There are these red chalk lines that indicate perspective. There is, when you look at the drawing in the exhibition, you'll see a trimmed outline. He's cut away much of the bottom of the drawing, stuck down another sheet, and reworked it. This is not a finished work. This, too, is an edited living drawing. And from these, you then move on to the set of drawings that do lead us to the famous prisons. But again, not a simple process. The 3 drawings that I've shown in the exhibition range in date from about 1742 through about 1748, and then the prisons themselves are printed for the first time in 1750. It's a long, iterative process. And he doesn't just make preparatory drawings. It's easier to talk about a preliminary sequence. He thinks about ideas through lots of drawings over years and then moves to the etching plates without making that one-to-one transfer drawings, such as the one we saw a few slides back. It's also interesting to see how such a diverse and various artist develops, stylistically speaking. And this is one of the things to look for, especially in the second section of the exhibition, which is dedicated to his 2 trips home to Venice in the mid-1740s, where he puts himself under the tutelage of the great Tiepolo. Now remember, Piranesi is from Venice, but when he left in the first instance, he had only had an architectural and engineering education. Tiepolo, there's no hint of Tiepolo in his early works, and I suspect that the painter and printmaker Tiepolo was of virtually no interest to the architect in training. But by the time he goes home in 1745 and then in 1746-47, Piranesi has realized that his career is not going to be as a builder, but rather as a printmaker. That's where he found success. That's where he was different from every other artist working in Rome. And suddenly, Tiepolo, the greatest artist working in Venice, becomes a valuable resource. And there's absolute evidence, both from early biographies and the evidence of the drawings themselves, such as this fantastical gondola, that Piranesi was literally working in Tiepolo's workshop. This gondola design, for example, is a kind of iteration of a famous drawing by Tiepolo himself. There are other studies where you can show the relationship directly between them. Now, this is a hard drawing to reproduce. I'm not sure how clear it is on the screen, so maybe it helps to zoom in and to think just how far this artist has come in 3 or 4 years from a guy measuring out ruled lines for classical buildings. There's a wildness to that chalk underdrawing, and yet these beautiful transparent washes and layers of wash. And then the stuff that he draws, the stuff that he imagines. You get a sense that he's really been studying the capricci and scherzi of Tiepolo as they come out of the printing press and coming up with ideas like this fantastical wing, nudes who hold medallions, all of this amazing rocaille ornament, a crown that seems to emit light, and water that seems to drip off the back of the upper parts of this gondola. There are shells elsewhere on the boat. There are dragons and satyrs and everything else. This surely was never a boat that was meant to float. And while the Venetians did sometimes make elaborately decorated ceremonial gondolas for the entrance of an important prince or king or pope to Venice, no such ceremony occurred in the 18 months when Piranesi was back. This is a pure drawing exercise. But remember my leitmotif. Never let a good drawing, never let a good idea go to waste. So when he returns from Venice to Rome in 1747, he picks up his Vedute di Roma series again. One of the first prints he produces is this view of the piazza of San Pietro in Vaticano, which we saw earlier. And if you look at lower left at that coach, you'll see a lot that's familiar, where the gondola with its wing and its nude holding the medallion have been transformed into a kind of land yacht. Again, something richer than any coach that anyone was driving around in Rome at the time, but which gives life and spirit to what was otherwise a rather straightforward view of the piazza. Now, against this practice of saving drawings to reuse them, recycling ideas, it's interesting to note that there's another kind of drawing that is very, very rare, for which we have very few complete surviving examples, but which exist largely as fragments on sheets of paper that were reused, cut apart, turned over, and used for new ideas. And those rare drawings, the ones he didn't keep, are in fact the drawings for all of those famous views of Rome. So, for example, on the back of this architectural fantasy in Berlin, at left, there's a fragmentary view of Castel Sant'Angelo, framed to match the actual dimensions of the print in the Veduta. It is clearly a drawing directly related to that print. On the back of this drawing in the exhibition from the collection of Vincent Buonanno, you see it there, on one side, a view of a printer in Piranesi's workshop. He couldn't help himself. He sketched constantly. And so you imagine him sitting at a table in the workshop, and the printers, with their rolled up sleeves and aprons and caps, pulling things in and out of the presses, are the subject of lots of his drawings. But it's equally interesting to walk around the back of this drawing, where you see fragmentary, upside down, the preparatory study for Piranesi's view of the Arch of Septimius Severus, produced right around the same time. And from the Morgans collection, this chimney piece design, a very rough, wild, exuberant drawing, which has on its back this rather schematic study for the view of the Temple of Castor and Pollux in the city of Curi, just north of Rome. Now you ask yourself, why not keep these drawings when he keeps so much else? And I think the issue is that these were not original ideas. This is not Piranesi thinking through a problem or coming up with an idea or adapting antiquity. These were functional drawings, and that once he'd made the print had the indication of what those buildings were. The drawing had no purpose as a kind of invention or an idea. Moreover, it's amazing how spare, how schematic these drawings are. And you ask yourself, how does he get from a sheet like that, or one of the very few examples that does survive still as a full sheet of paper, this example which is a study for that print, how does he get from one to the other? Now, I should say that every one of those drawings for review that survives intact comes from the last 2 or 3 years of Piranese's life. My theory there is that he just didn't get to the bottom of the recycling bin. He's throwing these things in a scrap heap and he's taking paper out, and some of them he simply didn't have time to cut apart and reuse. They all come from the very end of his life. But you ask yourself, how does he get from this to that? Wouldn't he want to show himself? Wouldn't he want to remind himself of things like the texture of the architecture, or, for that matter, the temple at the Foro Boario, or the bell tower of Sant'Orian Cosmedin that rises up behind this riverside building? Where are those in the drawing? Didn't he have it? And this relates directly to a story that's in one of the earliest biographies of the artist, written by an author named Legrand, who heard from Hubert Robert, the great French draftsman, also responsible for some fantastic views of Rome, who was Piranese's sketching companion. And Robert told Legrand that one day when they were drawing at Cori, in fact, it's the place they went together to this site north of Rome and made a series of drawings in 1762, 63, literally side by side. We have matching views from both artists. Robert asked Piranesi, well, I don't get it. How do you get from that? What are you going to do when you get back to Rome and you sit down at your workbench and you have to make a copper plate? And Piranesi smiles, according to the biography, and says, well, I'll admit they're kind of spare drawings, but don't worry. It's all up here in my head, and you'll see it on the plate. And while that sounds like your standard trope of art historical mythology, the drawings themselves bear it out. There is almost nothing in them, just a bare indication of architectural form. All the detail, which is reproduced in the prints with remarkable fidelity, was all in his head. Maybe there are some sketches that are lost, but certainly the big preparatory studies, both the fragmentary ones and the ones that survive, don't give it to us. To highlight the lessons that we learned from fragments, from the stuff on the backs of the sheets that he kept, the discarded bits, in the later parts of the exhibition, we get to this wall with 10 of his chimney piece drawings suspended in windows. Now, these were drawings which for Piranesi were worth keeping. We have 30 of them. There are another 20 at the Kunstbibliothek in Berlin and individual examples in all of the other big collections of Piranesi's drawings. They are not the documentary view of something, but a storehouse of ideas, responses to Etruscan and Roman and Greek and Egyptian art and architecture, fantasies that are based on animals and vegetables and everything else in the world. They're the storehouse of ideas. No matter how rough and sketchy, they're worth retaining, even when on the backs of reused pieces of paper. Because when you walk around the back of that wall, you'll see, upside down and turned every which way, the fragments that were on the backs of the recycled bits of paper. The view of the Temple of Castor and Pollux that I've just talked about, proof states of prints. Every one of these prints is a proof state. Unlike most printmakers from the Renaissance forward, Piranesi didn't keep his artist proofs as special objects for collectors, but those too went into the scrap heap to be cut apart and reused. And there are only about 8 intact proof states that survive. We have 4 of them in the exhibition with his hand-drawn corrections. Notes for that introductory text of the Diverse Maniere as well. You learn so much from the stuff that he didn't want to keep because he did keep the papers in the workshop. There's a whole story of how paper moves through the studio and how he thinks about the things that he's creating. And then finally, in the last section of the exhibition, opposite the window wall, we move to something entirely different, something unprecedented in his work, something that we're not prepared for, which are these large, complex drawings of Pompeii, Pozzuoli, and other sites in southern Italy, made on a trip he took in the last year or two of his life. These are large drawings, almost 3 feet across, in some cases complex collages stitched together. This drawing is in fact made up of 3 separate pieces of paper, still with Piranese's thread holding them together. Again, the exhibition bears close looking for things like that. And they're in this new style, much bolder, more schematic, with a reed pen, these heavy, thick, dark lines. And we ask ourselves, why? Maybe this is just an artist moving to a late style, but I think there's probably more to it. Piranesi made that trip to southern Italy with his son Francesco and the professional architectural draftsman Benedetto Mori. And I believe these drawings are actually collaborations by all 3, with Moro setting out the perspective scheme in thin black chalk lines, Piranesi, Giambattista Piranesi elaborating them, and then Francesco adding some of the figures. I think in particular those figures that are completely out of scale for the drawing, something that we will see in his own works later on after his father's death. And I think that schematic style is not just the result of the collaboration, but also because Piranesi realized that he was not going to live to turn these drawings into prints, and that would fall to his son to carry out, which in fact it does. Piranesi had a stomach ailment with which he had been afflicted for almost a decade by the time they went down to Pompeii in 1776 or 77. He was well aware of his impending mortality, because just near these drawings we see this sheet inscribed at the bottom, the idea of Piranesi for his tomb. It's a little complex to explain how he gets from this to the actual tomb monument, but the point is that he's aware that he won't be around. So I think that his schematic style is a way of giving clearer direction to Francesco on how to translate drawing into print. Francesco does make prints for a decade or more. He's just not very good at it. But rather than ending on the sad note of a sick Piranesi looking to set up his son in business, I'd rather end here, which is also on that final wall of the exhibition. Also in the thick pen and relating to Pompeii, a series of masks, such as you see everywhere in the mosaics and wall painting of Pompeii. And down here at the right, we see something that looks a little bit different. A figure not with that kind of classical hairstyle, but bald-headed, with big ears and prominent frown lines, which looks an awful lot like Piranesi himself. And if we had any doubt, he's even labeled it in his very distinctive handwriting, BP, Battista Piranesi. It's a humorous Pompeian self-portrait done in the last year or so of his life. Now, here's an unexpected Piranesi, one fooling around, mocking himself, not the furious madman that most people think of. No one ever talks about Piranesi's humor. We're all too much in awe of his sublime ideas, especially with the scholarly reverence of a couple centuries' distance. But there it is in the drawings. From the early joke about the Emperor Piranesi building a tomb to the mocking self-portrait that's the last drawing in the show. And I would say that it's only in looking closely at his drawings that we find this humor. The drawings show us not just how Piranesi thought and how he worked, but also when we really stop and study them, they give us a sense of the man. And on that note, I'll end and send you, well, I guess not back upstairs tonight, but I hope for another visit to look closely at the show, to admire not only the rich sublimity of Piranesi's ideas, but also the humanity of the artist that we see in his drawings. Thank you.